Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for the second STGlobal webinar in our Knowledge in Action series on effective scholarly communication for impacting the policymaking process. The mission of STGlobal is to inspire and challenge students to contribute to the forefront of research on science and technology policy and social issues, as well as to foster mutual understanding in the science and technology policy community. This webinar is co-organized with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, which you will hear more about later. Panelists today will share knowledge on scholarly communication practices, assessments of impact for scholarly work, as well as communication incentives and applications for science policy. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the Chief Outreach Officer for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm also a member of the STGlobal Content Committee for the conference, as well as this webinar series. We would like to thank the STGlobal sponsor schools, ASU, Georgetown, George Washington, UVA, and Virginia Tech. And I would also like to extend a special thank you to Sahil Mehta, who is JSPG's Director of Communications, and to Vanya Bisht from STGlobal for promoting the webinar. We hope this event will be informative and inspiring for all of you, and we're looking forward to your participation in today's discussions. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and we reserve the right to share the recording after the event. So if you have any issues, let us know. You can ask your questions for the panelists in the chat window, and please also note if your question is directed to a particular panelist. We encourage you to share about the event on social media by tagging SciPol Journal and STGlobal Conference on Twitter and using hashtag ScholarComImpact. So with that introduction, I would like now to introduce Dr. Elisabeth Graffy, who is Professor of Practice in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and in the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, or CSPO, at Arizona State University. Dr. Graffy co-directs the Energy and Society program within ASU Lightworks and the Environmental Humanities Initiative in the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. She founded and leads the Spirituality and Sustainability Initiative and the Household Independent Power Project. With 2 decades of governmental, private sector, and NGO leadership experience prior to joining the faculty at ASU, Dr. Graffy has advised and led numerous organizations and initiatives and authored dozens of academic, governmental, and other publications. Among her many accomplishments, Dr. Graffy was elected chair of the section on women in public administration, the largest membership section in the American Association of Public Administration, and continues to advise and consult on public sector projects. You can follow Elisabeth on Twitter, eGraffy1, as well as ASU and CSPO. Today, Dr. Graffy will provide an overview and describe applications of effective communication for policymaking. Thank you, Dr. Graffy, for being here and providing this introduction.
Thanks, Adriana. I'm really happy to be here today and really excited to be part of this panel. Issues related to the intersection between science and policy, scholarship and policy, research and policy are crucially important these days. And everything that we can do to bring clarity to those issues is all to the good. So what I'm going to do at the moment here is share my screen. I'm going to give an overview. I'm going to stay pretty high level, and I'm going to skate through a bunch of material knowing that the panelists that come after me are going to be drilling down into some specific areas and elaborate on things that I will only touch on in a cursory way. We're talking about increasing the impact of scholarship in the policymaking process, which can be interpreted a number of different ways. So I'm going to talk about today is a way of understanding that as not just increasing the effectiveness of communication at a point in time, but kind of through the process of policymaking, kind of in a system-wide sort of way, by focusing on the functions of information in policymaking, and using that as a way of diagnosing what effectiveness, usability, serviceability means. And if I can just get this, okay. So science communication, ways of improving it are, it's a topic that many of us think about, talk about, and there's lots of training about it. Usually training about effective science communication for policy includes recommendations to speak more clearly, use more visuals, but not too complicated, simplify your concepts, but don't dumb it down, know your target audience, really think about messaging, write in a journalistic way. And although these things are all very important, they miss a crucial piece that I want to talk to you about today, which is understanding the system within which this kind of communication occurs. So there are pretty long-standing assumptions about what the science-policy relationship is. And for purposes of this talk, I'm using science, research, scholarship kind of interchangeably. Also with the recognition that all of these activities take place in public sector settings, in academic settings, in non-governmental settings, even in private sector settings. There are lots of places where this kind of thinking and research goes on. But in any case, there's been an assumption for a long time that the science-policy relationship is linear, and that in the legacy model, science speaks truth to power, and that the focus is on getting the pipeline of information out to policymakers, and whether or not they use it has to do with how literate they are on technical issues and how rational they're going to be. And for the most part, that model involves insulating science from policy to keep it relatively pure, and to think of stakeholders as being the people that care about policy and are impacted by the decisions that are made. Newer models, there are various forms, but they replace the idea of truth with serviceable or usable or salient knowledge. They focus a lot on translating and engaging rather than disseminating. They focus on engaging stakeholders early to help form the questions and the research. And they talk about things like a market for information, getting supply and demand a little bit more aligned. These are great, but they are also, I think, too simplistic. And it's because they assume decision-making and policy-making are kind of static. And actually, they're social action words. So the policy process is largely involved in and cares about three big kinds of activities that overlap and also operate in a kind of a sequence and a dynamic interaction: agenda setting, negotiating, and problem solving. So that means you have to figure out what's important and then try to come to some shared understandings of what that means and what you might want to do, and then come to even more agreement about how you want to fix or innovate it and then carry those things through. Again, this is not a full model. This just kind of points to one. A fuller model of the policy process is this. So this is something that I developed empirically when I was national policy advisor in government. And we were faced with this very challenge of how to improve the effectiveness of scientific research and policy decisions. I worked mostly in the environmental area. And we had to figure out what the problems were, what the challenges were, where the bottlenecks were. And in order to do that, it involved having to actually do research, a lot of research, and to try to understand what the system was and what we were doing well and what we weren't. And one of the things that we determined was that most people, I don't know, can you see it when I use my cursor? Does that show? Yeah, so most people view the policy process as being sort of in these two categories. That's where, in fact, a lot of policy making does occur, rulemaking, all that kind of thing. But it leaves out all of this other stuff where the role of research and decision making is really pretty crucial. And this is what the model looks like when you include that into the picture. So this yellow line over here are the corollary functions of research and scholarship and science that go along with the activities that go along with policymaking. So, raising issues in policymaking is equivalent to announcing discoveries in science and trying to figure out what you're doing. All that agenda setting stuff is putting things into perspective, looking at scenarios, and then actually validating and informing choices and how they're done. There's a lot of dynamic refinement that goes on during implementation. And every once in a while, something happens that just blows up ideas. The things we thought we knew how to do, turns out we have to relearn them, or our assumptions don't work the way we thought they did, and then we have to kind of go back to square one and reframe. And I want to talk to you a little bit about just some really quick examples of what those things might be. So the discovery that carbon dioxide emissions and atmospheric levels were rising counts as a discovery, right? And we all know that climate change has been one of the most difficult issues to communicate about for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is that It was an unprecedented sort of discovery, and for a long time, people didn't know what to do with it. And then when you get to the rest of the policy process, it gets more complicated. One of the things that we learned empirically about framing, putting things in perspective, is that everybody thinks in narratives. So when you hear about messaging, getting the messaging right, getting the story right, getting the narrative right, it turns out that everybody thinks in stories. It's just they use different languages for it. I tested this when I was developing this model by literally running around and holding scatter plots up in front of people who I knew thought in technical data terms. They could tell me the story of the scatter plot. Some people, policymakers in particular, actually think in stories. And in politics and even beyond that, people talk in metaphors. They capture a very complex idea in symbolic terms and shorthand terms, and it packs a ton of information into what seem like very simplistic words, but they're not actually very simplistic at all. As one of my favorite examples of framing happened during COVID. This is from Twitter, and somebody was trying to explain the rationale of flattening the curve. And they translated into the metaphor of cattening the curve, that everybody knows that a chill cat laying around is much better in your house than a very alert cat that tries to rip up your furniture. And I thought that was pretty cute. Testing scenarios, this is something that researchers have only really are still trying to get good at. There could be quantitative ways of doing it, very qualitative ways of doing it, hybrid ways of doing it. But you can see from this example that I'm using here, which came from some narrative scenario work that I actually did with some colleagues at ASU a few years ago, that even scenarios build on the framing, right? So the idea of, trying to figure out how to characterize a future as hippies and cowboys or bootstraps or Saudi Arizona, that captures metaphorical and other sorts of understandings. There's framing built into the scenarios that you then look at to understand what you can learn about the feasibility or the desirability of those things. What does it look like when you put these things together? Just taking the case of biofuels. Biofuels originally started out as an agricultural economic diversification idea and moved all the way through all these processes to different kinds of legislation, to rulemaking in terms of harvesting guidelines, sustainability indicators, like all kinds of stuff. And then at some point, it became a climate change issue, which meant that things really dramatically changed about how policy development around biofuels evolved. It brought in entirely new stakeholders. It brought in new kinds of legislative discussions. It brought in new kinds of framings, and it got a lot more complicated. And now it's a very comprehensive and integrated and inclusive policy space that has even become one of the most critical elements of climate intervention in terms of what we might do if we try to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And it's just become that dynamic a place. If you don't have a model that allows you to see all those components and why they happen the way they do, then it's really hard to try to figure out like where you are in that policy process so that you can figure out how to effectively communicate. So again, I cruised over that stuff pretty quickly, but here are some best practices for communication. One is to recognize that it's an ongoing, diverse process that happens over time. It's not just a point in time. There are point in time communication challenges, but it's really good when you're trying to engage with issues to recognize that there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of different ways, a lot of different functional reasons to engage, and that there are multiple bites over time, not of the same apple, but of the same apple tree. And if you think about it that way, you can actually plan ahead. So if you think in terms of the functional purposes for sharing communication in the policy process, it will guide you toward the most relevant research questions. It will help inform the kind of communication content and style that you choose. And it will help you figure out who to engage and why, and develop a strategy, both short-term and long-term, for how you do that. It will help you recognize that the clearest and best answers to the wrong questions are not likely to be very helpful, but clear answers to salient questions are likely to have the most impact. It helps you recognize that information by itself isn't always very useful, but information plus framing really does matter. And in fact, I think I would argue that useful knowledge really depends on the combination of information and framing, and scenario development just adds to that even more. It's really important to recognize that all people use narratives and stories. They just use many different languages, from scatter plots to data sets to actual science fiction stories to other kinds of things, anecdotes from the campaign trail. These are all potentially related, and it's useful to understand how they intersect. And last but not least, the systems that I'm talking about are all interrelated. And it's part of the thing that makes it very challenging, but recognizing that there is all that dynamic stuff going on, in fact, allows for a more precise and effective communication when you want to engage. Last but not least, scholarship doesn't always have to be policy relevant. I love it when it is, but it doesn't always have to be. And part of the good thing about models like this is that it allows you to recognize when you want to be effective, what can you do to become more effective. But it also gives you permission to recognize when something that you're working on may not be policy relevant at a particular point in time, and that's okay. Last but not least, how do you decide if your communication is being effective? How do you decide if you're being successful? And again, I think there are a number of different ways to look at that, and it's important to think about the impacts in a proportionate way to what you think you're actually doing and where you are in that functional process. So I've worked with a number of researchers that believe that the only way to be relevant is for legislation to actually include language that you give policymakers. Same thing for rules. That's not true. That's not the only way to be relevant, and it's maybe not even the way to be the most relevant in the long term. There are also ways to judge relevance by the quality of relationship building, not just how many people you're talking to, but the quality of the interactions. Your diagnostic capability as researchers. How well can you understand where you are in the policy process so that you know how to plug in effectively? Same in terms of anticipatory capacity. If you know where you are in the process, then you can plan ahead. And even if you aren't working directly with policymakers, if you know where you are in the policy ecosystem, then some of the stuff that you're working on can enter into the policy process indirectly through other people that are advocating or stakeholders using your information. And then finally, of course, it's always really satisfying when something that you're working on actually improves the outcome of policy implementation and you can see the benefits that way. Thanks. That was all I wanted to say today.
Great, thank you, Dr. Graffy. That was a great introduction to the event. I had just had sort of one large question about, so we discussed this before in terms of what science means in the context of academia versus other settings. Can you talk a little bit about how, sort of science is viewed by academics, but also individuals in other settings, and how it's being communicated in government settings, for example, as you mentioned, storytelling as one effective way to do that. Are there other ways that this could be done more effectively outside of universities?
Yeah, so I did mention that research and scholarship are done. They're called different things depending what sector you're in. So inside government, for example, or inside the private sector, we don't tend to call it scholarship. We tend to just call it research. I think that there are different norms and expectations. So I'd say that scientific research that's done in the public sector is actually controlled by certain laws and norms. So it's understood that everything that's done in the public sector is is publicly available. So there's no such thing as proprietary research. In the private sector, some research is proprietary. In academia, it could be somewhere in between. So some things are public and some things are proprietary, and some things are simply just not readily available because they're just not kind of provided that way. And I think that some of the incentive structures are also different. I think some of the people on the panel are going to be talking about that. Some of the paths to professional development are a little bit different depending what sector you're in. And the kind of credibility and access that decision makers have to researchers in different sectors will also vary based on a number of different factors. So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but at least it starts to open the door.
Yes, definitely does. Thank you. We have another question in the chat about sort of how researchers can impact policy in a meaningful way. So if somebody wants to make a change in public policy, where does that fit in sort of in your model, and where would they start from?
Okay, so that's a diagnostic thing, and I think it depends a lot on the policy issue. So I'll give you a real concrete example of something that we actually, well, I'm not going to I can give you an example of something I'm doing now, but I'll give you a clear example of something that we did in government. The Safe Drinking Water Act is, so Congress writes public laws, right? The Safe Drinking Water Act has been on the books for a long time, and there had been a scientific discovery that arsenic levels in certain parts of the country in groundwater were higher than people thought. So there was some question about whether or not Congress is going to have to go and update the Safe Drinking Water Act for arsenic, change the standards. There's a lot of controversy about that. Nobody knew who had the best information. It turned out that in the agency I worked in, we had the best information, but it wasn't in a form we could give Congress. So using this model, I looked at where we were. So we were kind of early in that reframing stage because something had blown up. We were kind of back to the beginning, having to rethink things. And what I was able to do was understand what the policy process was going to be, from reviewing the legislation to changing it and then enacting it at EPA. So what we did was we set in motion a relationship building strategy to make sure that whenever our data were available and were conveyed in a form that other people could understand, that it could tap into either the legislative process or to the regulatory process down the road. And we just made sure that our units of analysis matched up and that the people that we needed to talk to were in that, that we were talking to them. You'd think that what I just said is the way things normally work, but it's not. But we did it that way, and we were able to get our information into that process.
Great,
does that answer their question? I think it might.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful for, I think, science policy and public policy, I think is becoming more popular, and a lot of scientists want to get involved, and there's a lot of training, I think, that's needed in this space, and also just knowing where to start. I think that's a good start to our panel discussion as well, to get more specific into that. So thank you so much for the intro.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the panel discussion. I will introduce our moderator, Nicole. Nicole is an early career policy ambassador, as well as NeuroPolicy liaison for the DC metro area chapter in the Society for Neuroscience. And she's also currently completing her final year of her PhD in neuroscience and cognitive science at the University of Maryland. And that's it. Nicole, turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bankston. So yeah, let's move on to our panelist presentations. First of all, we're very glad to have all of you here. Thank you for joining us today to share your expertise in scholarly communication and policy with our audience. In the interest of time, I'll keep my introductions brief, but panelists, you can feel free to provide longer introductions if you would like to. We're first going to start with Dr. Mark Neff. He is an associate professor of environmental studies at Western Washington University. Mark's work draws from the academic fields of environmental policy, science policy, and the science and technology studies. He also maintains an affiliation with the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. You can feel free to follow Mark and Western Washington University on Twitter at WWU. Mark is going to speak to us about how to incentivize science policy scholarship and ways in which society organizes and utilizes science to advance its interests. So Mark, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Let me get my screen sharing started here. Okay, thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you also to all of you who are in the audience participating in that way. For my talk, I'm going to zoom out a little bit from scholarly communication to think about the ways in which we organize science. So some of the institutions and cultures we've built around science and the impact that has on the utility or usability of the research that we do. My talk today is mostly going to be focused on academic science, so science conducted at universities. but probably has some relevance depending how researchers are evaluated in other kinds of institutions as well. Oh, there we go. Back in 2003, David Cash, Bill Clark, and a number of others wrote this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science called Knowledge Systems for Sustainable Development that I guess summarized a number of case studies they conducted through the years about science and decision-making relationships and the kinds of institutions that facilitate effective uptake and use of scientific information. And what they found was that knowledge that gets used has three attributes in particular. It is credible, as in it's rigorous science that stands up. It follows the methodological rigor that you expect, etc. Also that it is salient, and that is relevant to the decision at hand. And Dr. Graffy mentioned using appropriate units of analysis, perhaps methods that are accepted within a decision realm as being the most up-to-date, the most legitimate. And on a timeline where it stands a chance to influence a decision. You know, knowledge that comes too late is never going to influence the decision. And the third characteristic is knowledge that gets used is seen as legitimate. And that's something a little more complicated perhaps than those first two. And that is science has to be respectful to divergent values at play in a decision realm. Any policy problem you look at is amenable to multiple framings and framings that are occasionally incompatible because different stakeholders, different shareholders have different ultimate goals, different things they're striving for, and thus they frame the question differently. Legitimate science is aware of those divergent framings and is seen as respectful to those divergent values. These are as much characteristics of relationships or knowledge that emerges from relationships as they are characteristics of science or scientific fact per se. And they argue that in order to achieve usable and used knowledge requires building relationships. And this is a quote here: active, iterative, and inclusive communication between experts and decision makers proves crucial to systems that mobilize knowledge that is seen as salient, credible, and legitimate in the world of action. For knowledge to be used means that there is a mutual two-way learning relationship between those who are producing and those who are using the knowledge. This is distinct from kind of the latent model of science and society that exists in our academic world these days, predominantly in the United States, but also elsewhere. The model that we often follow is something of a loading dock model, as depicted by this cartoon here. Under the loading dock model, science does its thing inside the science factory, inside universities and other sorts of research institutions, produces their product where they set it on a loading dock for somebody else to come make use of. This is amazingly ineffective. The volume of science, of research that we've produced over the past half century it's unbelievable. And every day you hear frustrations from scientists that, well, we knew something was coming. Nobody's taking advantage of the knowledge. Why are we doing all this good research? Nobody is listening. We're not able to influence decisions. Part of that is the incompatibility between the findings that Cash et al. Published in 2003 and the latent model that exists in our academic culture of how science is produced and then made available for use. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of the history of our cultural notions of the loading dock for the remainder of the talk here. A lot of the policies and institutions that really define science for us today have their roots in the World War II and post-World War era. This is a photo of Vannevar Bush, name rhymes with beaver, no relation to other Bushes who've been in our government of late. And he, upon the close of the war, let me back up for a moment. During the war, he headed the US Office of Scientific Research and Development. And so this was kind of the mothership that oversaw the Manhattan Project, the development of radar, sonar, and a number of other truly transformative technologies that helps the US war effort. After the war, he was invited by the president to submit a report summarizing lessons learned about science and its contribution to societal outcomes. And he wrote a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. It's 75 years old this year, that really laid the groundwork for much of our current understanding of science, but also how it influences society. He wrote, "Scientific progress results from the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their own choice in the manner dictated by their curiosity for the exploration of the unknown." This is not a mutual learning relationship between the producer and user of knowledge. This is science operating in a separate, isolated context where smart people are asking interesting questions and developing methods that they deem to be most appropriate. Fast forward, 1962, Michael Polanyi wrote an important piece in Minerva, the journal Minerva, article called "The Republic of Science, Its Political and Economic Theory." And he wrote that science, within the scientific community, science is steered as if by an invisible hand, as scientists pursue their own success, adjusting themselves at every successive stage to the situation created by all others who are acting likewise. So scientists, responding to their own incentives in their own community, are steered like Adam Smith's invisible hand toward the ideal scientific agenda and methods and whatnot. And he said that the three criteria that scientists use to evaluate each other's work are plausibility, scientific merit, and originality. We're going to jump into the publication industry here in just a moment. And the outcome of this, the dynamics of the publication industry, combined with the self-governance model that Bush and Polanyi and others helped to push forward, the outcome is that those metrics of plausibility, scientific merit, and originality have more and more come to mean: how many papers do you write? What is the impact factor of the journal? How many citations do you accrue? This is how scientists have come to evaluate each other for questions of hiring and promotion and tenure. And that steers science. That's the ultimate lesson of this, is that these are steering science away from the usable knowledge model that Cash and others have helped to develop. Robert Maxwell is an entrepreneur who, he has quite a list here of attributes you might look at. He's a character that just gets more and more interesting the more you read about him. But where he's relevant to this story is that he founded Pergamon Press in the aftermath of World War II. Pergamon Press was one of the first commercial presses that was taking over publication of journals that previously largely had been published by scientific societies. As the scale of research ramped up with US government research spending after World War II, European research spending after World War II, there are a lot more products, a lot more articles coming out of science, and those scientific societies were unable to keep up with publication. Robert Maxwell saw a business opportunity. And with Pergamon Press, instead of waiting for scientific societies to say, "We'd like to start a new journal," he approached individual scientists and said, "You, my friend, are at the cutting edge of your field. How would you like to be the founding editor of a journal? This will cement your reputation." He wined and dined. He really drummed up business. And so it's changing the model of publication. And he did this because he felt full well that research institutions, research libraries that wanted to remain relevant in this era of expanding science had to have access to the information produced by science. There was a built-in market for everything he could publish. After a few ownership changes and reorganizations through the years, Pergamon Press is now part of Elsevier Press, which is part of RELX Group, publicly traded corporation that has an impressive hold on the world's scientific publication market. So they claim they publish 18% of the world's scientific articles and annual revenue in the billions. So this is a sizable corporation built on the back of science. it's unbelievably profitable for Elsevier. So their scientific research and scientific branch, that is the publishing we're talking about here, in 2010 had a profit margin of 36%. In 2012 and 2013, it bested 40%, which, if any of you pay attention to the stock market, this would be the envy of many of the tech companies that we now so celebrate. And they do it because we, academics, we write, review, and edit the content almost always for free, sometimes paying publication fees for the honor of giving them our content. All of that is funded by others, frequently government, and universities have very little choice but to fork over whatever the publishers demand for access to those articles, to those journals. As science is expanding, as the publication industry is expanding in the post-World War II era, it presents all kinds of challenges for libraries trying to understand what they need to subscribe to, and for researchers trying to stay current in their fields. So Eugene Garfield is another entrepreneur who entered the scene, and he developed First Current Content, which those of you who've been around a while, I remember in high school, these were on the library shelf for me. They're basically tables of contents of journals, so that you can, as a researcher, you can look through and see what's being published and figure out which resources you want to track down. In building current contents, he parlayed that into creating the Genetics Citation Index, which was the first resource that allowed researchers to follow citation patterns through time. Which articles, which people are citing which others. He built that then into what became the Web of Science and all of the related materials that became the Institute for Scientific Information, or ISI, Web of Science, depending what you want to call it. That, in the process of creating these products, he's the inventor of the impact factor, which I believe we're going to hear more about later today. And that impact factor and these citation chains have come to define how we evaluate each other for researchers. Jumping back to usable and useful knowledge. Dan Sarowitz at CSPO wrote this piece that I love to use when talking about these issues in classes. It's a worldview column he wrote in 2009 called A Tale of Two Sciences, that details work that happens at the University of Massachusetts Lowell at a little noticed research institute called the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. They have a small budget, to the tune of, I think, a couple million a year, and they've been unbelievably effective at contributing to outcomes that they're pursuing. They're doing it not by chasing publications, chasing citations. In fact, they produce very few publications and accrue very few citations, but they're having a massive impact. So in this article, Sarowitz details that the Toxic Use Reduction Institute achieved a 90% reduction in Massachusetts industry trichloroethylene use in 2 years, 90% reduction of this toxic solvent. Between 1990 and 2005, they helped Massachusetts firms to reduce toxic chemical use overall by 40% and chemical waste by 71%. The way they do this is they work directly with potential users of the knowledge they're producing. They're finding substitute solvents or substitute processes for toxic solvents by working with decision makers in industry to say, what are you trying to accomplish? How can we help you to accomplish that by using less toxic processes and materials? And it is that iterative, two-way, long-term relationship that Cash et al. Were talking about in that 2003 article. This is research that truly makes an impact on the world. It is a far cry from the research that we in academic science push each other to do with our focus on publication counts, citation counts, and journal impact factors. So I'll go ahead and end there, knowing that some of our other speakers later on will talk about some of the alternatives to this publication madness that we're currently experiencing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Next up, we have Dr. Jessica Polk. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so next we have Dr. Jessica Polk. She is Executive Director of ASAPbio, which is a nonprofit that advocates for preprints in life sciences. Jessica is also a Plan S ambassador, an affiliate of the Knowledge Futures Group, and a steering committee member of Rescuing Biomedical Research. You can follow Jessica on Twitter at Jessica Polka and ASAPbio. Jessica will tell us about preprints as an example of open access to promote research transparency and innovation in presenting scholarly work. Jessica, feel free to share your slides whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks again so much for having me here. Just as a by way of further introduction, a bit of disclosure, the perspective that I bring is one rooted in kind of biochemistry and basic life sciences. And ASAPbio is, as you heard, a small organization that organizes convenings and tries to promote culture change around the system of publication that Mark just so helpfully told us about. In addition to the fact that the incentives might not necessarily always align with what we might consider to be in the best interest of science and society, the system is also quite slow, meaning that research can spend months to years behind closed doors in a peer review process before being released publicly. And clearly there's negative implications for this when we're thinking about the fact that all research depends on accessibility of previous knowledge in order to proceed. But I think that what preprints offer, which is to say manuscripts that are submitted to a journal, typically the same manuscript will be posted by the authors publicly on a preprint server and is accessible to all readers across the world. And thereafter it can be exposed to feedback, ideas, and discussion that the authors can use to improve their manuscript, spark new ideas, inspire other scientists around the world, all during the time that the paper would otherwise be kind of in the dark, so to speak. I should say that preprints are free to access, but they don't substitute for the open access version of the final publication record, because sometimes, obviously peer review, while not perfect, does benefit science, improve science. And so those final versions can sometimes differ from the preprint versions as well. But nevertheless, preprints enable this kind of communication and acceleration of science. And so again, speaking from the disciplinary perspective of ASAPbio, in particular, preprints have played an increasingly large role in the life sciences over the past few years. They've had a long history in the social sciences, economics, and physical sciences, like through the archive. But over the past 5 years, they've really grown dramatically, with not only the very well-known servers, bioRxiv and recently medRxiv gaining in monthly submissions, but also other servers, some affiliated closely with publishers, gaining ground. This has been accompanied by strong funder policies and infrastructure accommodations for preprints. For example, preprints can now be found in lots of major search engines. They receive DOIs and in general are recognized by many funders as evidence of productivity that can be cited similar to journal articles. Preprints have also played a major role in the COVID-19 crisis, especially during the early days of the pandemic. A significant fraction of the research available on COVID was actually in preprint servers. This is, of course, related to the fact that in a time when time is of the essence, it's very important to get information out. Journal publication processes had to adapt, and certainly many journals have now implemented some type of rapid review pipeline, but especially during these early days, preprints provided a unique opportunity to communicate rapidly to the world. And as such, preprints have really begun to be mentioned in policy making in a way that they have not before, at least in the health sciences. So, for example, here's a medRxiv preprint that was posted very early in the COVID-19 epidemic. being cited by the UK government. So with some co-authors, we've taken a look at these COVID-19 preprints on medRxiv and bioRxiv and found that these preprints are receiving about 10-fold more attention in terms of downloads, visits, even citations, tweets, and news coverage than preprints that do not cover COVID-19. So this fresh attention on preprints raises important questions about communicating. I really appreciate what we heard in the first talk today about making sure that information is really easy to understand, is visually accessible. But we're now contending with how to reckon with information that is being posted without peer review. And in a recent survey that we ran of stakeholders, including mostly researchers, the most significant concern that people are having about preprints right now appears to be premature media coverage. So, certainly there's widespread acknowledgement of the fact that preprints increase the speed of research communication, provide additional exposure, and, again, they're free to read and post. But I think there is this renewed concern about what happens when information can possibly get taken out of context and used potentially to spread ideas that are not helpful on a larger scale. So, for example, many people talk about, we've had many positive examples of preprints being used, but a lot of people draw attention to this particular preprint, which was posted at the end of January. This turned out to be withdrawn by the authors within 48 hours of its posting after dozens of comments from the community. On one hand, I think you might say this demonstrates that the lightweight screening process that necessitates a rapid dissemination of preprints can potentially allow more error-prone science to see the light of day. But you can also say that sunlight is a great disinfectant, and that many people coming together and commenting on this article draw attention to the issues and actually stimulate a withdrawal by the authors in a process that's much more rapid than could ever have been achieved at a more traditional journal. So, I think this idea of science as an iterative process is also borne out in preprints. And preprints accelerate not only the communication, but the iteration over which correct ideas can be honed and further refined. So I just want to highlight that this is specific to COVID-19, this particular slide, but there are many projects that are aiming to provide formal review and commentary of preprints that can not only stand alone in some cases, but also complement and enhance the journal review process. So, for example, we saw several months ago many publishers calling for the review of preprints as a complement to the journal process, especially for these highly relevant COVID studies where perhaps more attention is warranted in order to make sure that results are truly robust. So I just want to say that at ASAPbio, we curate resources about preprints, and we have just started a new project on preprints in communication for general audiences. So representation of preprints in the media, labeling of preprint servers to make it clear, the review status of the preprint. And we're also going to be discussing how press offices and researchers can represent their preprints in the media. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues, our board, and our funders, and I'm looking forward to the remainder of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Polka. Okay, next up we have Dr. Whoops, sorry about that. Sorry. So next up we have Dr. Anna Hatch, Program Director for the Declaration of Research Assessment, otherwise known as DORA, as part of the American Society for Cell Biology, where she helps the academic community address biases and advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment. You can follow Anna on Twitter at AnnaHScientist and Dora at Dora Assessment. Anna will describe ways of evaluating the publishing process in order to achieve impact in science policy. So Anna, go ahead and share your screens whenever you're ready.
All right, can everyone see that? Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to participate on the panel. I'm really excited to be here today. Like Nicole said, my name is Anna. I'm the program director for the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA for short. DORA is an initiative to advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment reform globally and across all scholarly disciplines. So we have a pretty wide purview. But back at the heart, I think DORA began as a conversation at the 2012 annual meeting for the American Society for Cell Biology, when a group of researchers and academic editors were having a conversation on the poster hall, in the poster hall of the conference about the consequences of using journal-based metrics like the journal impact factor for the evaluation of academic researchers, thinking through what it meant for the academic workforce at large, and then also the broader effects that it was having on research culture. So since that conversation, it resulted in the writing of a declaration that was published a couple months later in 2013. And since that time, more than 2,000 organizations have signed DORA, and more than 16,000 individuals. And this word cloud I have here is really just to visualize the geographic distribution of DORA's organizational signatures, just to highlight how really and truly an international effort this is. So as in October, sorry, so last October, one of the things that DORA does is convene groups to get together. We co-sponsored a meeting with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute to think through ways to drive institutional change for academic assessment. And as part of that, we developed a one-pager that talks about the why the institution should care about responsible research assessment, and then paired it with some ideas for what institutions can do. So really, what I'm showing you here that sort of came out of that discussion is 5 common myths about the perceived values of journal impact factors. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I have them listed for you. But I just want to highlight 2. And first is the idea that quality research is easy to recognize. It's sort of that adage, like you know it when you see it. But we know from work from Paula Stefan that novel research often becomes influential and cited outside of the JIF measurement window. And not only is it the JIF measurement window, it's also the review, promotion, and tenure window sometimes too. And the other point that I want to make is that a lot of people say is that, JIF is used to measure quality. But we know from a recent survey that Erin McKiernan and colleagues did of institutions in North America that 40% of research-intensive institutions do mention JIF in their RPT documents, but they're using it in different ways. So while some institutions are using it to measure quality, not all of them are. So some of them are using it to measure importance, and others are using it to measure prestige. And so there's a lot of different things that lead us to say that, this is a really, really complicated challenge. And in fact, so even though today I'm only focusing on academic institutions, we've heard from others that, funders play a large role, as do publishers. So this really is a systems problem that involves many different stakeholders. And when we start thinking about solutions, one of the first steps is really to identify barriers. And so I have this illustration here of sort of like a young researcher looking up at a big barrier. And as we go through some of these specific barriers, I'm going to start at an institutional level and sort of move towards an individual researcher level. So at the level of an institution, institutions have to make trade-offs between their external pressures that they face. And these can be the things of needing to obtain grant funding to help support some of their overhead costs and operations, but also needing publications and citations to achieve a university ranking that they want, that will help them be competitive with their peers and attract students. And they have to balance this with their internal institutional values. And these are values that help them achieve their mission and vision of the university, and include things like student learning, research discovery, societal impacts like we're talking today, collaboration and inclusivity. So when they're thinking about what to evaluate, these are some of the trade-offs that they're having to wrestle with internally. And at the level of the individual researcher, this I think is summed up very well by an article that Naomi Albert-Baum and Wynn Pittston have out as a preprint right now, where they say what advances academic careers doesn't necessarily advance science. So here, when you think about things that advance academic careers, like Mark and Jessica sort of set up, are publications in prestigious venues, citations, grant funding, and that doesn't always necessarily advance the science. What really advances science is good scholarship practices. And that includes things like having high research integrity, accelerating scientific practice are sort of more the open scholarship practices like collaboration, data sharing, preprints, open access publications. And what I think is really interesting about this trade-off at the level of an individual researcher is what advances a career almost pushes a researcher to be more secretive, because if you want to publish in a high venue journal, you're not going to want to be data sharing or pre-printing because you want to remain competitive. So they're almost, well, not almost, they are disincentivized from some of these practices that really help accelerate research. Okay, and so now just sort of zooming out into one specific academic evaluation process is review, promotion, and tenure, but I think a lot of the principles remain true for academic recruitment and hiring too. So this is a lovely figure from work that Denon and colleagues did, where they're portraying sort of three main criteria in a review, promotion, and tenure, which is research, teaching, and service. And a lot of times, service and teaching are seen as necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. And so that means that researchers who are doing a lot or making a lot of contributions to service and teaching aren't necessarily getting recognized for the work that they're doing in those areas. So then they propose sort of flipping this into a 3-bucket system where each bucket has its own level where people are needed to meet. Okay, and I think, when we break this down into how can we do a better job with assessment for research, I think one of the big questions we have and sort of has been circling throughout the discussion today is that right now what's being used are citations, journal impact factors. So how can we measure the quality of research contributions without using those proxy measures? But for teaching and service, I think one of the important questions is how do we consider the impact and value of all scholarly contributions in this process? And then now sort of zooming into societal impacts, which is the main focus, these include things like public engagement, influence on policy, effects on community, participation in citizen science projects. In the introduction, Elisabeth had a beautiful long list too. But in terms of academic recognition and rewards, those are often lumped into the service category, so they're not always getting the recognition that they deserve. So as ways to help institutions think through and improve and iterate on their assessment processes, DORA developed a set of design principles based off of this meeting that we organized with HHMI last October to help institutions take action. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples of these. So one is to instill standards and structure in the processes. Through one idea for this is through a structured narrative. So we're seeing this at academic institutions like the Charité in Berlin, but also now at an increasing number of research funders, like the Dutch Research Council and UKRI in the United Kingdom. What I think is really powerful about these is that a narrative format allows researchers to contextualize their results. And so it's a nice complement to the metric. But what they also do is they introduce standards. So everyone is being reviewed in a similar way. So it's also helping the evaluation process. The other point that I want to make is the idea that it's important to foster a sense of personal accountability. Even if there are new research assessment policies, they're not effective unless they're uptaken by the community. And again, there are a number of ways that that can be done through working groups and workshops. One thing that I'd like to point out is UMC Utrecht hosted a series of town halls that they then fed into new institutional policies in this comment here, if you want to take a deeper look. And then the last point that I want to make through these principles is the importance and value of prioritizing equity and transparency. Again, numerous ways to do this. A couple of ways that we have seen at different institutions is using a neutral party to promote balanced discussions, the inclusion of untenured faculty in departmental tenure decisions, and sharing information about the integrity of the process. And I also point out an article down here by Nidhi Bala that has several specific proven strategies to increase equity that I think is very valuable too. And the last points that I want to make too is that ECRs can help drive a cultural change for research assessment. So I have one article highlighted by an early career investigator in France, Guillaume Lobet, who recommends removing journal title from academic CVs. So this is something that he has done, a very bold move. And he instead replaces it with things that he thinks are more valuable. So he includes article level metrics. He also includes reviewer comments on his papers to provide, again, more context. And then the second piece that I'm pointing out here is coming from a group of early career researchers in the Netherlands, where they, as part of an ECR think tank, at UMC Utrecht, they started a grassroots effort that resulted in a new evaluation system for PhD candidates, which is kind of awesome. So instead of being evaluated primarily on bibliometrics, they've expanded it to include other research competencies, as well as professional development being considered. And this is really when they addressed the faculty saying that there's a big gap in how they would like to be assessed and how the way assessment really isn't meeting their own personal goals. So the last point that I'd really like to make is sort of, I've been talking a lot about responsible assessment, and equity and inclusion and open scholarship have also been part of the conversation, and it's a big theme, I think, of today as well. And that's the idea that all of these areas overlap and intersect at different places, but really ultimately they're pushing towards a better research culture, and a better research culture leads to better science. And with that, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening, and I have a list of DORA's supporters as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hatch. So our final speaker is Dr. Adriana Bankston. Okay, so Adriana is the Chief Outreach Officer at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. JSPG is a vehicle for early career researchers to publish on science policy topics. Among her many roles, Adriana is also co-director of the Policy Task Force at Future of Research, a nonprofit organization that empowers early career scientists. You can follow Adriana on Twitter at Adriana Bankston, and you can follow JSPG at SciPol Journal. Adriana will discuss how early career researchers can get involved in the policymaking process and how JSPG can enhance their professional development in policy research and writing. Adriana, go ahead and share your slides when you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. So one of the things that we've discussed here today is the impact of communicating scholarly work to a broader audience and the importance of open access as well as rapid publication in the sciences. And some of these same principles apply in the policymaking process, where there are universal processes in which scientists can influence policy using effective science communication. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about sort of the policy side of this continuum and how early career researchers can utilize their scientific expertise to influence policymaking through effective communication, as well as the role that JSPG plays in this process. So in order to really capitalize on what Anna mentioned, also the engagement of early career researchers in policy and their ability to make an impact, just sort of a call to action that early career researchers should engage in policy for many reasons, but these are a few of the benefits in that engagement in science policy can influence your ability to address societal problems and really having a broader impact than you might be able to have in your bench research. You may be able to influence an area that you're really passionate about, and that's very motivating, as well as really becoming involved in the larger community in this interplay between science and policy. And just two sort of large points to make here. One is that your voice matters. And so just because you're sort of early and starting out doesn't mean that your people won't listen. And you do have a lot of expertise that you can utilize in policymaking, and that's very valuable. So keep that in mind as you engage in science policy. So one thing to remember is that science and policy, as has been alluded to before, are very interconnected and bidirectional, and that they influence each other, which is why scientists need to be trained to talk to policymakers and vice versa. And these are just two of the fundamental concepts looking at science for policy and policy for science. So science for policy is where scientific findings are used as the basis for the development of public policy. And the other side is policy for science is government laws, regulations, and policies that affect the practice of science. And just to keep this in mind, that there is a very strong interplay between science and policy, and it is very interconnected. And for crafting policy specifically, communication is really important in terms of policies that need to be clear, having language that can be understood by non-scientific audiences. And here are just a few of the questions I wanted to highlight in terms of thinking about what you might want to consider when you're crafting a policy. So the proposed policy should be thoroughly researched as well as clear and concise. It should be clear what your goal is, as well as who will be affected and how it will be implemented. So some of these considerations are looking at the broad landscape of the political scene, as well as what's going on in the scientific workforce, and how these two interconnected, and that the policy that you're looking to draft that would sort of connect these two would fill a gap that doesn't already exist or hasn't been filled, and would accomplish something that would really push the field forward. And again, just some practical considerations in terms of how this policy will be monitored, enforced, who will manage it, how much time and effort it will take, etc., as well as looking at both short-term and long-term impacts on various stakeholders that are involved, and just general considerations to think about here. So now I'm going to just give you a few tools to think about how you might impact science policy as an early career researcher. And as a researcher, you already have a lot of tools and skills that you can use to impact the policymaking process. Your expertise, as I mentioned, is really valued in this area. You already have also skills in project management and data analysis, and writing policy is really a large part of what policymaking entails. So this is something that you can really only learn by practicing and editing and re-editing. And so JSPG, which I'm representing here today, is really, I think, a good way to kind of get your feet wet in writing policy and understanding what that looks like and what that means to really make an impact. And so just want to transition now to talk to you a little bit about what JSPG is and what we do. So it is an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed publication, as well as a nonprofit. It is managed by and for students, policy fellows, and early career scholars from all backgrounds. And we really want this to be a place where not only early career researchers publish their work, but also it becomes a forum where policy can be debated in different settings at different levels, and really sort of giving early career researchers a voice in policy through the journal, as well as initiatives following the publications. Our mission then is largely to help students and early career scholars to bolster their research and writing credentials in science and technology policy, and really encourage them to engage in debates at all levels of government. And we do this not only by publishing at a specific timeline and with different partners that I won't go through all that, but there is an international outreach as well as promotion via social media and other channels to really elevate the publications and the authors and their voices in policy through events following the publications. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what we publish. So we publish a lot of different types of write-ups, as you can see here, including op-eds, technology assessments, memos, analyses, and others. And we really cover pretty much every corner of science and technology policy. You can see a list of all the topics here. Just to name a few: artificial intelligence, STEM education and workforce, science communication, the government, university, industry interfaces, among others. And so we're really aiming for this to be a place where early career researchers from a lot of different fields are able to publish their work. And as I mentioned, we also elevate their work through different channels. So just want to highlight a few things here. One of our recent publications is an issue with the UNNGCY, which is the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. This has been a really great partnership that has led to additional events as well. And again, looking for ways to elevate this issue more, but it's been an exciting endeavor. Another way is through online webinars. So you can see here in the middle, we recently did a webinar with AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, which was really well attended and again gave, I think, really useful information about science policy careers. We also have a new podcast that we just released, the second episode, called SciPol Soundbites. You can see the cover art here. Really, the goal is to interview authors and to have them talk about their publication and sort of broader implications in society, and again, elevate sort of their voices and policy through this medium. So feel free to check it out. And then we also do trainings. So you can see here, I participated recently in a policy memo writing competition with the National Science Policy Network, which was very actionable, and sort of they're able to get tips as well as practice writing memos, which I think is very helpful and timely. And we're also collaborating with University of California, Irvine, and other groups listed here on a certificate program for science policy and advocacy for STEM scientists, which is largely graduate students and postdocs. And this is a virtual course where, again, we teach sort of basics of science policy as well as try to give them kind of real world experience and practice. And so these are all different ways that you can engage with JSPG through the journal, submit to the journal. So our next deadline is November 15th. That would also allow you to be featured on the podcast, which will become I think, more prominent feature in the future. Our editorial board is also made up of early career researchers, and some of these trainings, I think we'll be doing probably more of this in the future as well. So that's really all I had to say. This is my contact information. Happy to discuss more about JSPG or science policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana, and thanks to all of our panelists for taking some time to speak to us today. We have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So I actually wanted to start with a question that we received through the Q&A during this webinar. Evan asks, is it okay for research to not be relevant to policy or society? If it is not, how do we equally measure equality between relevant and non-relevant research? Do any of our panelists want to take that question?
I'll say a couple things about it. One is not necessary, and nor can it always be the case, that research is relevant to an identifiable policy issue. The question about how one evaluates the quality of research that isn't policy relevant, I think, has been spoken to indirectly by every one of the panelists in different ways. And I think Anna's presentation was one of the most cautionary in a sense, because she lumped a lot of the policy, more policy relevant research into service, which according to her dots was the least important of the three buckets that people might be evaluated on. So I think that how folks get evaluated on these things depends where you are, and the definition of policy relevance depends where you are. I'm going to give you a quick example to just illustrate that. The best you can do is try to figure out what the right questions are about any particular area that you find yourself curious about. And if sometimes you can choose things that are going to be policy relevant, but you can't necessarily always define research questions with the intent that it will be policy relevant unless you're in a policy environment and you have a particular job, a particular task to do research on a policy question. So a quick example. When I got to ASU, there was a lot of furor going on about the effective rooftop solar. And I was curious about how that affected utilities and some of the controversies. So that led to a whole several year research agenda. I had no idea if it would be policy relevant or not. I just wanted to know the answer. And by the time the article came out, it was so controversial, I thought this could be career ending if I publish it. So relevant or not, it may be a bad idea. Published it anyway. And that particular article, that first one in a couple that we did, has ended up getting picked up and cited in law course books. It was cited by state regulators. It was picked up by a bunch of national media. It was read by a White House policy advisor. No way would I have guessed that when we started out on that research. And so I think there's a certain amount of humility about being able to predict, even though I gave you a great diagnostic model that works, you can't always know what's going to be policy relevant and what's not.
Thank you, Dr. Graffy. One quick question for Adriana. Rachel asks, how can we apply for the JSPG editorial board?
Yeah, so we can discuss that offline as well, but we have applications several times a year. Actually, we just accepted a whole bunch of new people. But I think the best thing to do right now is to keep in contact with us, and we can let you know when the next deadline comes up. Thank you for your interest.
Thanks, Dr. Bankston. Here's one that might be good for Dr. Polka or Dr. Hatch. So do you consider writing blog posts a productive tool for science policy communication, or where might be a good place to start contributing your opinion?
I think that, my expertise is a little bit more in the traditional scholarly communication space, so I definitely defer to other panelists here. But I definitely think that blog posts and social media is also an option. I just want to highlight that there definitely are preprint servers and repositories that also can host documents and provide a DOI and permanent archiving if you're interested in having something that's a bit more of a permanent object that's citable.
Yeah, and I would say I think blog posts are an excellent way to communicate. And I think, it sort of speaks to one of DORA's main goals is how can we recognize a variety of academic contributions and reward those? And blog posts certainly fall under that category. And in fact, I think, a couple of the blog posts that I have written are more widely read and have reached a much broader audience than some of the more traditional journal articles that I have written. And I think, it starts this sort of like larger conversation too about how do we recognize impact in a non-traditional way, sort of outside of the prestige of the venue where it was published. And I think being able to articulate some of these things, like I published this blog post and then here's the effects that it had, by contextualizing that is a really good way.
Thank you both. I also have a question for Dr. Neff. So how can we enhance communication between scientists and policymakers? And then related to that, some ways to maybe incentivize scientists to become more involved in government and policy work.
Yeah, I'm going to take just a moment to reflect on that previous question as well about the blog post. Policy happens in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. I would hazard a guess that a blog post is not going to be super influential on a formalized regulatory decision process, but it very well may influence public opinion or get things picked up by a newspaper or a widely visible press of some sort. So different kinds of impact with different kinds of publications. About that one, the most recent question, how do you incentivize researchers, particularly academic researchers, to work more with decision makers, or at least make that a successful route to tenure hiring, tenure promotion? I thought Anna, Dr. Hatch had some good suggestions there with valuing narratives as opposed to just the quantitative metrics. Probably every researcher who's been at it for a while has, the anecdotal narrative of like, oh yeah, so someone picked up this article, or I reached out to someone who read this article, and here's what happened in an agency, or here's what happened at a business, or here's what happened. And you hear about these things. Maybe even that you find out through one mechanism or another that your article is now being used for teaching purposes in numerous classrooms. That's a huge impact that is not picked up under citation counts. So allowing researchers to report those narrative experiences as they occur makes space for those other modes of communication that really also have important impact in different ways. So that's how I'd answer that. That's the fight I've been fighting at my university within my department, is to value those narratives. And despite everyone knowing better, we're still stuck on the quantitative.
Thanks, Dr. Neff. That's helpful. So I think that a lot of our attendees at the webinar today are interested themselves in getting more involved in policy. So one question we received was, what are some ways pre-tenure faculty can gain policy experience and engage with policymakers?
So did the questioners give any indication about who they think policymakers are? Because that's always, they didn't.
They did not, but that's a great point.
So as Mark mentioned, there are a lot of ways, policy gets made, and I mentioned this in my presentation, and it's come up indirectly in others. There are a lot of ways that policies are made. I think you can look locally, you can get involved in local issues, you can look nationally, get involved in national issues, you can get involved globally. That's a little bit of a more vague policy environment that you have to know how to work with that. It sort of depends what you're interested in, and then you look for ways to tap in. It seems like one of the more difficult choices for pre-tenure academics would be along the lines of what Mark just talked about, what Anna presented about, which is the reward system. So being able to take that time, right? Being able to take the time and then being able to turn it into something that is an asset instead of something that you're doing on the side that that you feel is a counterweight to what you're supposed to be doing. Anna or Mark, what's your thought on that? Or anybody else, but.
From my experience, it really helps being in an institution that that doesn't identify as a research institution first and foremost. There's just a lot less productivity pressure, and that opens up space for some of these other modes of interaction. That's not a solution for everyone. So I think some of it has to come through institutional change. It is hard and it is slow. I have to say the existence of DORA has not only educated me as I'm learning about these issues, but also allowed me to better articulate and justify some of these proposals within my own university. Change happens, as you know, people who study science will know, study science as a social process know, change happens most readily with generational turnover. And so what I would say, you know, to early career researchers, even if you're fighting a fight that seems fruitless, you are the generation that will be in charge soon enough. So don't forget what you know now, right? So keep pushing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, I mean, like when you know sort of one institution, you know one institution of what their sort of like policies and processes and values are. And one of the things that DORA is really working on doing is surfacing examples of good practices or new practices in assessment to help other institutions experiment with and redefine and rethink through sort of their own policies and practices. I've certainly heard anecdotally from a number of researchers that, you know, they're passionate about certain things like teaching or even policy making, but doing so detracts from research, which is really what's driving their promotion and tenure. And sometimes, you know, I think that translates to also to hiring. So you know, I guess all this is coming to the point that I said, you know, clearly institutional change is necessary, and we're hoping to get at that by sort of surfacing these examples of good practices to help other institutions experiment a little bit more easily.
Are we allowed to ask other panelists questions?
Go ahead.
As a quick comment on what Anna said, but then I have a question for Jessica and Mark. It's kind of like a joint question. I wanted to suggest, one of my colleagues got interested in child safety around pools, not her field, but she really felt strongly about it, and she ended up figuring out how to turn it into a research project. So one of the ways that people can handle getting involved when they're pre-tenure or post-tenure is by kind of really thinking about why you're interested in a particular policy issue. And you'll more than likely realize that what you do for a living has something to do with why you care about it, and then you can turn it into a research project, write a paper about it, get a little bit of grant money, and then you're kind of on your way. The question I have for Jessica is, it's about preprints, and there's a question in the chat about the post-truth world. The significance of framing is huge in the translation between science and policy back and forth. And I've had some concern, I'm curious about your thoughts about it, with the impact of preprints, particularly on really controversial issues. I mean, climate change, COVID, you know, things that have a lot of ambiguity in them where we're really trying to learn, right? We're still trying to understand what the discoveries are. they clearly play a big role in Mark's loading dock idea. I mean, they play a big role in getting the science out there, more access to it. What role do they play in the credibility, legitimacy, just being able to be clear about what we think we are understanding about the body of knowledge as it evolves?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think concerns about how preprints are going to be interpreted by academics or by people for whom, typically when we present non-peer-reviewed work in the past, that's been through a conference or at some other venue where the assumption is that the primary audience for that research is other researchers. I think that there's where this ties into credibility, I think, is that, unfortunately, peer review is very useful and it is contributes very strongly to credibility in science, but it's not perfect. And so there are many cases where failures in peer review, I think have also potentially damaged society through this assumption that if something is peer reviewed, it's thereby true. So I think that there's the best contribution I think preprints can make is that they invite readers to read them with skepticism. And I would argue that readers should probably be reading more scientific articles skeptically. But what I think that the best strength of preprints is that they actually open a dialogue between the scientist and the reader in a way that a published article does not. A published article is very much this is set in stone, this is the version of record, we're not going to be changing this article. This is, it's kind of, this gives this impression that this is final. A preprint can be versioned, it can be updated, it can be improved. And so my hope for preprints is that while certainly having fewer controls on the information, which is in itself, I think, a feature of this new environment in which we're in, where information is being exchanged in a much more distributed fashion rather than through gatekeepers and curators exclusively. My hope is that preprints enable improvement and a more robust pursuit of science overall in aggregate as we enable researchers to find and improve errors and potential areas where their results can be strengthened over time. I hope that answers the question.
I think I agree with everything Jessica just said. One of the ideals that some people talk about with improving science and society relationships is opening peer review and broadening peer review, because the voices that matter in evaluating research, it's not just other researchers in your narrow field, it's broader than that. And that might include informing how results are framed or presented in context with other policy questions, et cetera. So I think it potentially helps in that way. I'd also say that I don't know that the preprints create a problem that doesn't already exist at the publication and uptake interface. And that's that we have so many different disciplinary and methodological approaches to evaluating different questions that to an outside audience, it's really hard to evaluate, those different approaches. That already exists with or without preprints. So there's already so much room for mistaken uptake of research findings. I'm thinking here, I'm a runner. I use a buff when I run so as to try to minimize the spreading of droplets. And there was that paper that came out that was reported in the press as saying a buff is worse than not wearing anything at all because it apparently made the particles you breathe out smaller and therefore more likely to stay airborne for a longer period of time. Turns out that study was misinterpreted by the journalists that wrote it up. It was a study proposing a new way of evaluating masks, and they only evaluated one buff, right? So it wasn't intended to evaluate that question, yet it went out in the world and caused a big stir, right? So what I would say is both with formalized publication through the peer review process and the preprint publication of results. Researchers have an obligation to own their results and communicate those results and do those interviews with journalists, even if they're scary and awkward and prone to misunderstanding. You have to own those results and present them in context such that they are used appropriately, whether that's a preprint publication or a more formalized post-peer review publication.
Those are great points. Thank you so much. I have two more questions for you all before we wrap up. So one is a pretty general question. I think there are quite a few early career researchers on this call who may know for sure that they want to go into some kind of science policy career, or some who are interested in learning more. Do you have any examples of different types of opportunities that they can pursue while they're still in graduate school to gain the skills they need to enter science policy careers? And then also what kind of science policy careers are out there?
So I can take this to start. Yeah, so I think what I would suggest is getting involved with local science policy groups, as well as looking at what organizations exist on the national level, and sort of cultivate both of those as you move along. As was already mentioned, blog posts and other ways of writing about your research is very helpful for building your skill set. As well as if you're really interested in going into this field, there are a lot of different policy fellowships that you can apply to, as well as positions. So in terms of the titles, not to get too deeply into this, but there's sort of a continuum going kind of from doing more research, so like a policy analyst, all the way to lobbyist who's sort of on the hill and building those relationships with policymakers continuously. I would say probably most positions are somewhere in between that. And the other thing to consider is what kind of setting you want to work in, whether it's a university or government. That can also differ or make your experience different, even though it's all science policy, but where you are will sort of change your day-to-day and what you do.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bankston. Okay, so let's wrap up. I can share our wrap-up screen, and then Adriana, if you want to just give a closing message.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We just wanted to leave you with a call to action to visit the STGlobal conference website for our Spring 2021 conference. We also want to thank again to the STGlobal sponsor schools. And we invite you to submit your policy work to JSPG by November 15th. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, where we'll be posting about the editorial board as well, or on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram at SciPol Journal. And thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.